used to work the night shift at a campground. From midnight to 8 a.m., long and lonely hours stretched ahead of me. The job wasn't bad. I'd bring my PlayStation 2 and spend most of the night gaming. Hardly anyone ever came by, and even on the busiest nights, I'd only have to deal with 1 or 2 people. But the real issue was the isolation. I was completely surrounded by darkness, sitting alone in a tiny shack. During my first week, the guy who worked the shift before me shared a strange story. Just a few feet from my shack, there was an old payphone, and every night, at exactly 4:17 a.m., it would ring once. He told me he assumed it was some kind of automatic test call, but he had never answered it. For months, I forgot all about the phone. The summer was hot, I kept the windows closed, and I never heard it ring. But when mid-August rolled around and the nights got cooler, I started leaving the windows open, and that's when I noticed it. Every single night at exactly 4:17 a.m., the phone would ring. But it didn't sound like a normal ring. It was muffled, deep, almost distorted, like the phone had been submerged in water before being placed there. For a few days, I just listened. But then, something about it started getting to me. A strange, growing unease. Eventually, my curiosity got the best of me. One night, I decided to answer it. I set my alarm for 4:15 a.m. and waited by the phone. At exactly 4:17, it rang. I picked up, and there was nothing. Complete silence. It felt like someone was on the other end, listening but not speaking. I said, "Hello?" a few times, but there was no response. I hung up. I tried this every night for a week, but the result was always the same. After that, I decided to ignore it. But the unease never really left me. Then, during the first week of October, I made the mistake of answering it again. I set my alarm, dragged myself to the phone, and at exactly 4:17 a.m., it rang once more. I picked up. Again, silence. I was about to hang up when I heard something. A sharp, raspy inhale through clenched teeth. And then, a voice. Gravelly. Rough. Like someone had been gargling stones. "Can you hear me?" A chill ran through me, but my hand didn't move to hang up. The voice spoke again. But this time it said my name. Not just my first name. My full name. First, middle, and last. Like it knew me. Like it had been waiting. My throat went dry, and I stared into the darkness outside my shack. At that moment, I felt something watching me. Something that didn't belong. Then, the line went dead. With shaking hands, I placed the receiver back on the hook. But my mind wouldn't stop racing. Whose number was this? I dug into my pocket, pulled out some change, and dialed *69 to trace the last call. The screen displayed a number, but the call wasn't from anywhere nearby. It had come from California, but I was in Indiana. And even worse, how did it know my name? When I was 10, I moved in with my dad. A new environment, unfamiliar streets, and people I had never met before. My dad was friends with a family, a single mother with 3 kids. Thankfully, one of them was a girl a couple of years older than me. She was 12 when I met her. At first, we weren't very close, but over time, our friend groups started to overlap. I will never forget that night. She and her younger brother were home alone. Their mother was working the night shift, just like always. But that night, they weren't really alone. Their mother had been helping a woman through work and had gotten to know her well. That woman had a sister who had recently been released from a mental institution. No one thought much of it. "She's fine now," they said. But was she? Around midnight, there was a knock at the door. My friend knew her mother always knocked in a certain way before coming in. Without hesitation, she opened the door, but it wasn't her mother. A woman stood there, staring with cold, empty eyes. Her greasy, unwashed hair clung to her pale face. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with barely contained rage. She stepped inside without a word, her eyes scanning the room like a predator searching for prey. The younger brother immediately sensed that something was wrong. Without a second thought, he bolted out the door, running to the neighbors for help. But his sister wasn't as lucky. No one knows exactly what happened next. When the police arrived, they were met with an eerie silence and the thick metallic scent of blood. They searched the house until they found her in the bathroom. Her body was in the bathtub, mutilated beyond recognition. But something was missing. Her head was gone. Authorities searched the house for hours, even unwrapping the Christmas presents, desperate to find it. I don't know exactly where they did. All I know is that I wasn't allowed to go to her funeral. And from that night on, I never truly slept again. About 15 years ago, something happened to my wife's grandmother, an event that was told in our family for years. It's still hard to believe that such a kind, graceful woman experienced something like this. After her husband passed away, she started volunteering at the town's library to avoid loneliness. It was a small town where everyone knew each other. But you never know when you'll come face to face with real danger. It happened on a cold, windy winter evening. The library closed at 5 p.m., but sometimes there was extra work to do. That day, she stayed a little longer to help organize some documents. On her way out, another volunteer offered to give her a ride home, but she declined. "I could use the exercise," she said with a smile. She should have taken the ride. Her house was about a mile away, and the route passed through a lightly wooded, isolated area. She had walked that path countless times before, but this time, something felt different. Shortly after she started walking, she heard footsteps behind her. At first, she ignored them. Maybe someone else is heading home from the library, she thought. But the footsteps were getting faster and worse. Whoever it was getting closer. She couldn't see the man following her, but she could feel his presence in every fiber of her being. A silent alarm went off in her head. Still, she was almost home. She had left the lights on to make it seem like someone was inside. She just needed to hold on for a few more minutes. Then, a hand, cold, hard, clutching her shoulder. And then, a whisper, soft, but carrying the weight of a deadly threat. "Don't move. Hand over your purse, or I'll cut you up right here." Time seemed to freeze. In just a few seconds, thousands of thoughts collided in her mind. But she wasn't just a graceful woman. She was also someone who had carried a small .38 in her purse for years, never once needing to use it. Until that night. With one swift movement, she stepped forward, spun around, and pulled the trigger without hesitation. The gunshot echoed through the trees. The man's eyes widened in shock. The gurgling sound from his throat haunted her dreams for years. He collapsed to the ground, bleeding, unable to speak a single word. By the time the police arrived, he was still alive, but there was no more fight left in him. He spent the next 5 years in a prison hospital before dying from complications. Until the day she passed, my wife's grandmother always said the same thing whenever she told the story. "I wish I had waited just a little longer before pulling the trigger. I wanted to see his face more clearly." When I was around 8 years old, my older sister would babysit me when our parents were out. Since there was a 7-year age gap between us, she would often go outside to smoke, leaving me alone. Back then, smoking wasn't as frowned upon, but our parents always made her smoke outside. One day, when my sister went outside to smoke, I noticed something strange. At the end of the road, almost every day at the same time, there was a white SUV parked, unmoving. The windows were so tinted that you couldn't see inside. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but over time, seeing the same car parked there every time my sister went out began to feel unsettling. One day, when my sister noticed the car parked there again, she saw it just sitting there, watching. She didn't pay much attention to it at first, but after a few more days, the same car reappeared, and that's when she started to feel something was wrong. The car would stay there for hours, not moving at all, just watching. Whenever my sister would go inside, the vehicle would slowly drive off and park a little further up at the church parking lot. But at that point, we realized something was off. Whoever was in that car seemed to be watching my sister. One evening, my sister went outside to smoke again, and sure enough, the white SUV was there. We were home alone that day. She was a little upset and said, "Enough! I'm putting an end to this." Despite her fear, she bravely walked toward the SUV. But with every step she took, she started feeling a strange sense of dread. Later, she told us that she had this overwhelming feeling that something was terribly wrong. "I just knew, with every step I took, that if I kept going, I'd be walking straight into danger," she said. She quickly turned around and went back inside. It was an experience she'd never forget. One night, the family car was in the shop, so we were stuck at home. The SUV showed up again. My sister was outside smoking, and I was with her. Suddenly, the SUV appeared again. My sister told me to go inside and tell my dad. I ran inside and informed him. As a police officer, my dad immediately grabbed his gun and headed down the driveway, but he didn't point it at the SUV. He just wanted to make sure it noticed him. As my dad approached, the SUV slowly started moving. But when my dad got closer, it suddenly sped off, tearing down the road and disappearing onto the highway. My dad carefully noted the make, model, and year of the car, especially the fact that the license plate was covered with duct tape. The next day, the police came and searched the area but found no trace of the vehicle. The SUV was never seen again. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Why had that vehicle been watching us so intently? What did they want? I still ask myself, what was it about us that they were trying to learn? Were we just passive observers that day, or was there something much deeper going on? I was about 15 minutes away from finishing my night shift when a loud crash shattered the silence of the office. The impact was so strong that my coffee cup on the desk trembled slightly. I immediately stood up and looked around to locate the source of the noise. Someone had thrown a huge rock through the front window. What made this even creepier was the fact that my workplace was in an abandoned industrial district at nearly midnight. There wasn't a single open business around. The thought of someone lurking outside at this hour sent shivers down my spine. I quickly returned to my desk and called security to report the incident. But even after hanging up, I couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my chest. I decided I had spent enough time in that building for the night. I grabbed my things and headed for the exit. But no matter how much I tried to act normal, my heart was racing. As I stepped outside, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that someone was watching me. Was it just my imagination? Or was there really someone out there? The paranoia grew stronger with each step. My instincts screamed at me to hurry, and in the end, I gave in to fear. I ran to my car, jumped in, and locked the doors. The moment I turned the key and heard the engine roar to life, I sped off, eager to put as much distance as possible between myself and that place. About 10 minutes later, as I neared home, my breathing slowed and I started to relax. I'm just overthinking things, I told myself. But then, suddenly, I realized something that made my blood run cold. I never unlocked my car when I got in because the door was already unlocked. A wave of nausea hit me. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. I quickly pulled over, reached back, and ran my hand over the back seat, just in case someone was hiding there. Nothing. Trying to shake off the growing paranoia, I called a friend. He told me he was out drinking, and I decided to join him. I didn't feel like driving anymore, so I hopped on my bike and started riding toward him. The night was peaceful. A gentle breeze blew through the empty streets. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. Then, I heard it, the sound of a bicycle behind me. I straightened up, moving to the side of the road. Someone was riding past me, very slowly. As they came level with me, they turned their head and shot me a grin. A grin so wide, so unnatural, so insane. I flinched, my mind struggling to process what I had just seen. As the person pedaled ahead, I glanced at their bike, and in that moment, my stomach twisted into knots, because that bike was my mother's. The second I realized it, a surge of pure panic took over. I gripped the handlebars and pedaled as fast as I could, my breath ragged as I raced home. When I finally reached my house, my worst fear was confirmed. My mother's bike was gone. But then, something even worse caught my eye. One of my car doors, the back left one, was slightly open, but I had been driving alone. So who opened it?